It was supposed to be a simple solo hiking trip. I had done hikes before, short ones, local ones, but this time I wanted something a little more remote. I picked a long trail in a forested area about 5 hours from home. It was called the 10 Pine Loop. According to the map, the trail looped for around 18 miles through the hills and forests, circling back near where it started. I planned on doing it in 2 days. I brought a lightweight tent, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a small stove, a GPS device, a printed topographic map, and a compass. I parked my car at the trailhead just after 9 a.m. It was late summer, dry, warm, and quiet. There were only 2 other cars in the lot. I didn't see anyone around. The place smelled like dry leaves and pine bark. I strapped my backpack on, double-checked the GPS signal, and started walking. For the first 6 or 7 miles, everything was exactly as expected. The trail was well marked. Occasional faded signs nailed to trees pointed toward landmarks: Clearwater Creek, Pine Ridge, Stone Bluff. I passed a few switchbacks through thick pines and scrubby oak. I even crossed a small wooden bridge over a dried-up streambed. The heat was rising fast. By noon, it was near 90 degrees. I drank more water than I planned to, but figured I'd refill from a creek marked on the map at mile 10. Sometime around 2 p.m., I reached a fork in the trail. One way was marked 10 Pine Loop, east side. The other just had a faded arrow. I checked my GPS. For some reason, the screen was blank. I tried restarting it, but it stayed frozen on the loading screen. I pulled out my map. It was hard to tell where exactly I was since there weren't any landmarks nearby. I figured the left trail with the arrow was the right one, since it looked like it curved in the direction I was supposed to go. I went that way. After about 30 minutes, the trail became more narrow. There were fewer signs, no more footprints, no more cut branches. I felt like I was pushing deeper into thicker forest, and the sun wasn't hitting the ground as much. But I kept going. I didn't want to backtrack for no reason, especially with the heat and my backpack already starting to feel heavier. I kept walking for another hour. The trail narrowed to a thin dirt line between brush. My legs were getting scratched. I noticed the pine trees started thinning out and being replaced by more scrub oak and thorns. That wasn't supposed to happen based on the terrain map. The air started to feel more dry. The heat pressed down on me like a weighted blanket. I stopped to drink. I had already gone through nearly 2 liters of water. My shirt was soaked, and my lips were getting dry. I kept checking my GPS, but it stayed frozen. I sat on a flat rock and pulled out the map again. The problem was, the fork I took didn't show clearly on the map. There were old logging paths in this area, and I figured I had taken one of those instead of the trail. I considered turning around, but I had already walked about 4 or 5 miles since the fork. I decided to keep moving, thinking I'd eventually reconnect with the main loop. Big mistake. Another hour went by, and the trail disappeared completely. There was no more path, just scattered dry brush and angled, rocky ground. I started to get nervous. I checked the time, almost 5 p.m. The sun was starting to lower behind the ridge to the west. The air cooled slightly, but it was still dry and still. Not even a breeze. I looked around. I couldn't see any sign of a trail, just trees and rocks and a steep slope to my left. I decided to try and climb a bit higher to see if I could spot anything. Maybe a clearing or another trail. I struggled up the slope, using tree roots to pull myself along. At the top, there was just more brush, more silence, and more trees. No trail, no markers, no footprints. I realized I was lost. Not just turned around, completely, entirely lost. I hadn't seen another person all day, and my phone had no signal. I looked at my GPS again, still frozen. My heart started to beat faster. I sat down on a large flat rock and tried to calm myself. I wasn't going to panic. I still had food. I had water purification tablets. I had my tent and supplies. I'd camp for the night, then figure it out in the morning. I found a relatively flat spot beneath some trees, cleared some of the brush, and set up my tent. As I was doing that, I saw some animal tracks near the soft dirt, probably deer or elk. Nothing fresh. That comforted me a bit. I boiled a little water from a nearby muddy puddle and added a purification tablet. Then I poured it into my bottle and drank slowly. Tasted like metal, but it helped. I ate a granola bar and laid back inside my tent, listening to the sounds outside. Crickets, leaves rustling, maybe a bird or two. But something felt wrong. It wasn't the forest. It was too quiet. There were no frogs, no distant water sounds, not even wind. Just dry leaves and stillness. It was like the trees were holding their breath. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up when it was pitch dark. My tent was stuffy, and I could hear something moving outside. It wasn't large, but it wasn't small either. Slow steps snapping twigs, maybe 30 feet away. I held still. The steps stopped, then continued a bit further. Then nothing. I didn't sleep much after that. I laid there, sweating, heart pounding, waiting for morning. The first light, I packed everything up fast. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to move. I tried heading back the way I came, but within an hour I realized I had taken the wrong direction. Everything looked the same trees, same brush, same rocks. My compass needle was acting weird, twitching like it couldn't pick a direction. I don't know if it was the minerals in the ground or damage from the heat, but I couldn't trust it anymore. By noon, I was completely disoriented. I climbed a ridge to try and see anything. I spotted a dry ravine below with some exposed rocks. I decided to follow that, thinking maybe it would lead to a stream or a lowland where I could get my bearings. I walked through the ravine for 2 hours, feet aching, mouth dry, eyes scanning every shadow. That's when I slipped. The rocks were loose under my boots. My left foot gave out and I slid hard down the slope. My ankle twisted. Pain shot up my leg like a lightning bolt. I screamed through my teeth and grabbed onto a root to stop myself. My backpack pulled me sideways, and I hit my shoulder hard on the rocks. I sat there for a long time, breathing, trying not to cry. My ankle throbbed. I pulled off my boot and saw the swelling already starting. Not broken, but definitely sprained. I wrapped it with a compression bandage and forced the boot back on. I used a stick as a crutch and hobbled forward. I had to keep going. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I just laid on my pad under the trees, using my backpack as a pillow. I ate a few nuts and sipped my last purified water. There was no sound again. No wind, no animals, just dry stillness. The third day, I started seeing signs of old human activity. Rusted cans, a broken fence post, what looked like a collapsed shed. I followed the direction those were leading, hoping to find a cabin or a road. My ankle was burning with every step. I walked for hours, sometimes crawling. Eventually, I found a dirt road. Faint tire tracks. No sign of cars or people. I followed it. It took the entire afternoon, but I finally reached an old service building. Locked, windows broken. But taped to the inside of the door was a weathered emergency contact sheet for the park rangers. I had no signal, but I saw a barbed wire fence nearby, which usually means boundary property. I followed the fence line. Just before sunset, I saw movement. 2 people in orange vests walking down a slope with clipboards. Surveyors or fire crew. I limped toward them, waving both arms. They saw me. They ran up and gave me water, then called for help on a radio. They told me I had wandered over 7 miles outside the loop trail, into a fire-scarred section closed for rehab for over 2 years. The trail I had taken wasn't on public maps anymore. I had followed an old maintenance route. They took me to a ranger station where I got checked out by medics. My ankle was a bad sprain. I had dehydration, some cuts, and exhaustion, but no serious injuries. They said if I hadn't found that road or those workers, I probably wouldn't have made it another day. The heat was rising again, and no water sources were active in that zone. They gave me a ride back to my car. I drove home slowly, barely able to press the gas pedal with my ankle. That night, I sat in my apartment, silent, staring at the walls. I couldn't stop thinking about that silence out there. That deep, dry, endless quiet. The way I kept thinking someone would find me. The way no one did. The way the forest didn't care. I still hike, but never alone. And never without a printed map, 2 GPS units, and a flare. Because I learned one thing very clearly. When you get lost out there, the forest won't help you. And if you wait too long, no one else will either. I don't know why I picked that trail. Maybe it was the silence I needed. Maybe it was the pictures I saw online of the untouched valleys, thick forests, and high ridges. I'd been hiking for years, solo most of the time, and I knew how to read a map, pitch a tent, build a fire, and carry just enough food without being weighed down. I liked pushing myself, and I liked being alone. It was the only time I felt quiet inside. The trail wasn't a famous one. No campgrounds, no ranger stations nearby, no rescue call boxes. Just a thin, rarely used track that went from the side of a gravel road into the forest and vanished behind layers of pine and alder. The kind of trail that didn't show up on the more popular hiking apps, but you could find it if you knew how to look. Old USGS topo maps, Forest Service PDFs from the early 2000s, those kinds of things. It was marked as unmaintained, and that was the main appeal for me. I didn't want a wide, groomed path. I wanted the raw kind of nature where you had to crouch under branches and cross streams without bridges. I started early in the morning on a Thursday. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be out for a couple days. That's what I always did. It gave me a sense of freedom. I had my GPS tracker in my bag, but I rarely turned it on unless something went wrong. The first few miles of the trail were perfect, quiet, cool, shaded by tall spruce and Douglas fir. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground that hadn't seen sun in weeks. The trail twisted up a hill and then dropped down the other side where the forest grew thicker and darker. Everything smelled wet and clean. By late afternoon, I'd reached a wide bend in a small river where the water pooled deep and clear. That's where I set up my tent. I boiled some rice and jerky, watched the sky go from pale blue to deep gray, and then rolled into my sleeping bag as soon as it got dark. No sounds except the slow gurgle of the stream and the quiet clicks of insects in the trees. The first night passed like any other night in the woods. Cold, silent, empty. I slept hard. The next day, I packed up and pushed deeper into the forest, following the trail as it grew more faint. After about 2 hours, the path almost disappeared. I had to stop and look for cuts in the undergrowth, bent twigs, patches of flat earth. It became more of a game, trail finding. I liked the challenge. There were no signs, no markings, and no fresh footprints in the dirt. Felt like no one had been out there for years. Sometime around mid-morning, I crossed an old log bridge over a narrow gorge. It was half rotted, and I tested it with each step, feeling the wood sag under my weight. On the other side, I found what looked like an old hunter's camp. Not a full site, just some stones laid in a fire ring, an old rusted pot, and a stump that had been worn smooth like a seat. It looked like nobody had used it in a decade. I kept walking. About an hour later, I felt it. That weird sensation when something shifts in the air around you, like the trees are holding their breath. I stopped and listened. Nothing moved. No squirrels, no birds. Even the insects seemed gone. The only sound was my own breathing. I brushed it off and kept moving, but I started scanning the trees a little more, looking over my shoulder more than usual. Every now and then I thought I heard twigs snapping behind me, but every time I stopped to listen, I heard nothing. Maybe I was just tired. That evening, I set up camp in a dense patch of forest near a dry creek bed. The tree trunks were packed close together, and their branches hung low, making it feel like a ceiling was hanging above me. I ate quickly and got into my tent before dark. I didn't build a fire that night. I felt too exposed. I didn't know why. It took me hours to fall asleep. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear something. A rustle in the bushes, a soft thud, or maybe just my own heart beating loud in my ears. I kept holding my breath to hear better. But the more I listened, the more I convinced myself it was just the wind or the forest settling. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. They were soft, slow, but steady. I know what deer sound like. I know what a bear sounds like. This wasn't that. These were two-legged steps. Deliberate, not shuffling, not scurrying, not random. Step, step, pause, step. I laid frozen in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. My hand slowly moved toward the small hatchet I kept next to me. The steps circled the tent once. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there, stiff and quiet, until the sky finally began to brighten. When it was light enough, I stepped outside. Nothing. No tracks, no torn branches, no signs that anything had been there. But I knew what I heard. I packed up quickly that morning. I was deeper in the woods than I'd planned to be, and I didn't like how exposed I felt. The path ahead wasn't even a trail anymore. I had to rely on the GPS map on my phone and my compass. I decided I'd push forward until I found a clearer path or some kind of forest road to lead me back out. I figured I'd do a loop instead of backtracking. But by noon, I realized I had made a mistake. The land dropped sharply, and the brush grew thick and tangled. There was no clear route forward. I had to bushwhack for over an hour, crawling on hands and knees in some places. I checked my map again and realized I was way off my intended line. Then I found the claw marks, not scratches from branches, not grooves made by machinery. These were deep cuts in the bark of a tree about 7 feet off the ground, torn in a vertical pattern, like whatever made them had stood upright. It wasn't fresh, maybe weeks or months old, but it looked raw, angry, like an animal trying to mark territory. I kept moving, now more anxious than ever. I didn't eat lunch. I just walked. That afternoon, I thought I saw someone watching me from the ridge, just a flicker of movement between 2 trees. I stared for 10 minutes but saw nothing. I told myself it was shadows or light, but the knot in my gut kept tightening. I made camp near a boulder field that evening, more out of necessity than comfort. I was too tired to keep going. I didn't sleep at all. I heard noises all around, rocks falling, branches cracking, breathing that wasn't mine. When dawn broke, I found something new, a footprint, in the dirt just 20 feet from my tent. It was human, barefoot, larger than mine, deep. I don't know why I didn't run right then. I should have, but I told myself I was just overreacting. I packed up fast and started hiking west. I planned to get to a forest road I saw on the map and follow that out. It would take a full day, but it was better than staying another night. But it was already too late. By late afternoon, I realized I was being followed. I didn't hear footsteps anymore. I felt them, the sense of something behind me, always just beyond sight. I started looking over my shoulder every 10 seconds. Sometimes I thought I saw someone ducking behind a tree. Sometimes I thought I saw a shoulder or elbow slip behind cover. I picked up the pace, walking until my legs burned. I didn't stop to rest, didn't eat. I just kept moving. But the woods never ended. The road didn't come. At dusk, I found something that made my stomach drop. A shirt, tied to a branch, dirty, torn, hung like a marker, like a warning. I moved past it fast, heart racing. My mind kept going to the same place. Someone had lived out here, or still did, and maybe they didn't like company. As night fell, I didn't make camp. I kept walking in the dark with my headlamp. Every noise was sharper, louder. Every tree felt like it had eyes. My battery started to flash low. I kept walking. Then I saw the fire, faint through the trees maybe a quarter mile off, flickering orange, low to the ground. Not a forest fire, a campfire. Someone was out there, but I didn't go toward it. Something in my brain screamed not to. My legs turned and took me the other way. I walked until I couldn't feel my feet anymore, until I found a narrow ridge and climbed up it, laying flat behind a cluster of rocks, hiding like an animal. I didn't sleep. When the sun came up, I started hiking again. I didn't use the trail. I just moved in one direction, west. I drank the last of my water and kept going. Around noon, I heard a motor, a chainsaw, not near me, but close enough to carry through the trees. Maybe a logger, maybe a road crew. I moved toward it as fast as I could. Took me 4 hours to find the source. A back road, gravel and narrow, with deep ruts from big trucks. I stumbled out onto it like I was coming out of a war zone. There were no trucks in sight, but I could see old tire marks and fresh sawdust. I followed that road for what felt like hours. Then I heard a truck coming. I stepped into the middle of the road and waited. When the truck rounded the bend, the driver slammed the brakes and stared at me like I was a ghost. I must have looked wild, dirty, scratched up, eyes wide. He rolled down his window and stared. I didn't explain anything. I just asked where the nearest town was. Started on a Tuesday morning. I had taken the whole week off work to clear my head. Things had been stressful lately, just life stuff, really. The job was fine but draining, and my phone never stopped buzzing. I needed to unplug, and I figured a solo hiking trip through the backcountry would be the right kind of medicine. I chose a trail system I had read about months earlier in a travel blog. It wasn't one of the famous ones filled with tourists. This one was tucked away in the northern part of the state. Remote, long, rugged, the kind of trail where you might not see another person for days. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed my large hiking backpack with enough food, water filters, and supplies for 5 days. I brought an emergency beacon just in case, and a satellite GPS, though I didn't plan to use it much. I wanted to go old school, just me, a compass, and a map. The drive out to the trailhead took nearly 6 hours. As I left the highway and moved onto smaller forest roads, I lost cell signal. Felt good, honestly. Quiet. I parked my car at a small dirt lot near the entrance, locked everything up, and left a paper note on my dashboard about my planned route and return date. The trail started just past a wooden sign with faded letters and a warning about wildlife. There was no one else around. The first day was perfect. The sun was out, and the sky was wide open. I hiked deep into the woods, up through a thick forest of pine and fir. The air was clean and cool. My pack was heavy, but I felt strong. I walked for hours, taking short breaks every couple miles. At one point, I crossed a narrow creek where I filled my bottles with filtered water. I set up camp near a moss-covered rock outcropping as the sun started to go down. I ate a freeze-dried meal by a small fire and went to bed early in my tent. The second day felt just as good. I woke with the sunrise and made instant coffee. Everything around me was calm, just birds calling, trees swaying, and the occasional squirrel darting across the forest floor. I moved farther north along the trail, and by noon I had passed the 20-mile mark. My legs were sore, but I pushed on, wanting to cover as much ground as I could. I passed no other hikers. That night, the weather turned. A heavy wind picked up around midnight and started shaking the walls of my tent. I woke to the sound of branches creaking and distant howls of wind rushing down the slopes. I stayed awake for hours just listening. I knew the tent could hold, but it was hard to relax. The third day changed everything. I had planned to take a detour toward a loop trail that curved around a small lake deep in the forest. Maybe fish a little if I found time. But I missed a marker. That's what I think happened. Anyway, the signs out here weren't great. Most were just carved wood nailed to trees, and some had clearly fallen or rotted. I kept following what I thought was the right trail, but after an hour, the ground started to change. The path got narrower, rougher, more overgrown. I checked my map, and it didn't match what I was seeing. Still, I figured I'd keep going just a bit farther, thinking maybe I'd reconnect with the main trail up ahead. But I didn't. By noon, I knew I was off trail. The forest looked different, thicker. The trees were taller and darker, packed tightly together so sunlight barely hit the floor. The ground underfoot was soft with years of pine needles, and there were no more clearings. I stopped and pulled out my map and compass. I tried to orient myself, but every direction looked the same. Trees, hills, more trees. I wasn't panicking yet. I had the GPS in my pack, but I didn't want to use it unless I had no other choice. I prided myself on being able to navigate without it. I figured I'd just backtrack. I walked the way I thought I had come from, but after another 2 hours, I saw the same dead log I had passed before. I had walked in a loop. That's when I started to get nervous. The sun was already sinking behind the trees, and I knew I didn't have enough daylight to try another direction. I set up camp in a small clearing, far from any trail. I built a fire, but it didn't help much. The woods felt heavier now. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. I kept hearing faint cracks of branches. Not wind, but something else. Small sounds, like something walking. I tried to write it off as deer or raccoons. I barely slept that night. By the fourth day, I had to admit to myself I was lost. I finally turned on the GPS unit. Took a long time to find a signal. When it did, the map showed that I was more than 6 miles off my planned route, deep into an unmarked section of forest that didn't even have clear names on the screen. Just green. I packed up quickly and began heading south, toward where I knew the original trail ran. I moved fast, following the GPS, but the terrain slowed me down. Thick brush, fallen trees, uneven slopes. I kept having to go around small ridges and ravines. I fell more than once, scraping my arms and knees. Around midday, I stumbled hard and rolled down a small hill, landing flat on my back. My backpack cushioned most of the impact, but I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. I tried to stand. It hurt badly. I could still walk, but I had to limp. The pressure made me wince every step. I still had food, still had water, but I was slower now, and I knew if I didn't make it to the main trail soon, I might not be able to hike out at all. That evening, I found a small stream and made camp nearby. I soaked my ankle in the cold water for a while. It helped a little. As I sat there with my stove boiling water for another meal, I looked around and realized something. There were no animal sounds. No birds, no insects, no movement. It was dead quiet. I didn't like that. I ate quickly and packed everything away. I didn't want to start a fire. I just crawled into my tent and lay still. That night, I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, slow, crunching of leaves. A pause, then another step. They moved in a circle around my tent. I held my breath. My hand was wrapped tightly around my small knife, though I knew it wouldn't help much. The steps weren't heavy, but they were deliberate. Human? Animal? Couldn't tell. They stopped at one corner of the tent and stood there. I didn't move. The steps started again, slow, moving away this time, fading. I stayed frozen for hours. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. Nothing was there. No tracks that I could see, but my nerves were shot. I packed quickly and started walking again, ankle throbbing. Every sound made me jump. Every bird call felt like a warning. I just kept walking. That day, the GPS lost signal again. I didn't understand why. I climbed a high ridge to try to get it back, but no luck. Clouds were rolling in fast, thick, gray ones. Rain started falling by afternoon, and the trail, what little of it I could follow, turned muddy. My boots were soaked. My clothes stuck to my skin. I was cold, tired, hungry. I forced myself to keep going, telling myself I had to be close. But I wasn't. That night, I didn't pitch my tent. I just curled up under a large fallen log, trying to stay dry. I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, slower. They didn't circle. They came straight up to where I was. I pressed my body flat against the ground and held my breath. Then silence. I waited a long time before lifting my head. Nothing. But that wasn't true. About 20 feet away, just barely visible in the low light, there was a man, standing, not moving. His clothes were dark, wet. I couldn't see his face. He was just there. I didn't move. He didn't either. I closed my eyes and counted slowly. When I opened them again, he was gone. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I ran. I didn't care about the ankle. I ran through brush, through mud, through whatever was in front of me. I just wanted out. I didn't stop for hours. Around mid-afternoon, I found the trail. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. A simple dirt path winding through the trees. Familiar, safe. I dropped to my knees and cried. I followed it south, fast as I could. I didn't care about pain anymore. By sunset, I reached a trail marker I recognized. 10 miles to the parking lot. I set up camp again, this time near the trail. I didn't hear footsteps that night. I still couldn't sleep. The next day, I hiked the last 10 miles. I moved slowly. My legs ached. My ankle was swollen. But I made it. When I saw my car, I almost broke down again. I drove back into town. My phone lit up with texts and missed calls. I didn't answer any of them. I never told anyone what happened out there. I don't know what I saw, or who. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the isolation, hunger, and fear messed with my mind. Maybe it was a hunter or another hiker. but I know what I felt. I don't hike alone anymore. Not after that. I always liked hiking alone. There was something peaceful about being out there with no one around. No phones ringing, no people talking, no traffic. Just trees, dirt, and time moving slow. I had done plenty of hikes before, some easy ones, some tough ones. I thought I had seen it all. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't. This happened in early October, when the weather was just starting to change. The air was crisp, especially in the mornings. The leaves had started turning orange and brown, and a lot of them had already fallen to the ground. I took a few days off work to clear my head and decided to go hike a trail I found online. It wasn't too far from where I lived, about a 2-hour drive north, near a forested area that bordered a few national parks. The trail wasn't very popular. I picked it for that reason. I don't like crowded places, especially not when I'm trying to enjoy nature. It was listed on a hiking forum by a guy who said it was peaceful, lightly marked, and about 18 miles round trip, including a loop that went deeper into the woods before curving back to the start. He warned that the loop section wasn't clearly marked, but said it was easy to follow if you had good sense of direction and a decent offline map. I thought that was good enough. I downloaded the map, packed my bag, and left early in the morning. I reached the trailhead around 7:45 a.m. There was no one else there, just a small dirt patch for parking and an old wooden sign that was half faded. It had the name of the trail carved into it, but most of the letters were chipped away. I parked, stretched a little, tightened the laces on my boots, and started walking. The first part of the trail was beautiful. It was mostly flat with some gentle slopes, and the trees were tall and spaced out. I could hear birds chirping and the crunch of leaves under my feet. The air smelled clean. I walked for about 2 hours before I reached the split, the part where the trail branched. One side was the main route that led to a lookout point and back. The other was the loop, the part that went deep into the woods before swinging back. I didn't stop to think. I took the loop. The beginning of the loop wasn't bad. The trail was narrow and overgrown in some parts, but it was still visible. I followed it for a good hour without much trouble. Then I noticed the markers started to disappear. There were no signs nailed to trees, no ribbons, no small stacks of rocks. I still had my map, though. I checked it every 20 minutes or so to make sure I was on the right path. According to the GPS on my phone, I was exactly where I should be. But then the trail started fading. It didn't happen all at once. It was like the forest started swallowing it little by little. First, it was the grass that grew tall enough to cover the path. Then it was the tree roots and the fallen leaves that made everything look the same. I kept walking, trying to match the turns and curves on the map, but it got harder to tell where the trail was. Every tree looked like the last. Every direction looked right and wrong at the same time. Around noon, I stopped to eat. I found a big flat rock under some trees and sat down. I had a sandwich, an energy bar, and some water. I checked my phone again. I still had battery around 70%, and the GPS still showed I was on the loop. I rested for about 30 minutes and kept walking, but something didn't feel right. The ground was getting wetter, like the soil had soaked up rain from days ago. I hadn't seen any signs of animals, no tracks or droppings, just trees and silence, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. And even though I hadn't seen any markers, I kept moving forward. I didn't want to backtrack. I thought I'd waste more time going backward than just pushing through and finishing the loop. I made a mistake. By 2 p.m., the trail was completely gone. I stood there, surrounded by trees, holding the map in my hand, trying to find any clue. A log, a patch of dirt, a bush that looked stepped on. Nothing. I checked my GPS. The dot said I was on the trail, but there was no trail in front of me, just thick forest. I decided to go straight, thinking I would intersect the curve of the loop if I stayed in that direction. But the terrain got worse. There were more fallen branches, and the ground sloped downward. I slipped a few times. Once, I caught myself on a tree branch, and it snapped off in my hand. Another time, I slid on a patch of wet leaves and fell hard on my hip. I got up, brushed myself off, and kept moving. I was starting to feel tired. My legs ached, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I stopped again and drank more water. I had about half a liter left, not including the backup bottle in my bag. I thought I'd be done in 3 more hours, maybe 4. I could tough it out. But then the sun started going down. The trees blocked most of the sky, so it got dark fast. I hadn't brought a headlamp. That was dumb. I had my phone flashlight, but I didn't want to use it yet. I tried walking faster, but every step felt like guesswork. I take 10 steps and look around, then take 10 more. My sense of direction was all over the place. I checked the GPS again. The dot hadn't moved much, even though I had been walking for a while. I refreshed it. Nothing changed. Then the GPS froze. I closed the map app and opened it again. Took a while to load. The spinning icon just kept going in circles. Then it gave me a message, location signal lost. I stared at it. I held the phone above my head, turned in a circle, and waited. Nothing. No signal. No map. That's when I felt it. Not panic. Not yet. Just this sinking, heavy feeling in my gut. Like something inside me realized the truth before my brain did. I was off trail. I had no idea where I was. I was alone, with no signal, no markers, and maybe an hour of daylight left. And I had made a choice that couldn't be undone. I didn't sit down. I didn't cry. I just picked a direction and walked. I didn't know where it led. I just didn't want to stand still. The trees looked closer together now, like they were squeezing me in. The ground was uneven and rocky. Every step felt like it took more energy. I kept looking over my shoulder, even though I knew no one was there. By the time I pulled out my phone again, it was almost dark. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it ahead. The beam lit up trees and branches, but nothing familiar, just more forest. I walked with the flashlight for another 20 minutes before I decided to stop. I found a patch of flat ground between 2 thick trees. I cleared away the leaves and sat down. I had a thermal blanket in my bag, so I wrapped myself in it and leaned against my backpack. I had some snacks and water left, and I told myself I'd wait for morning. Maybe I'd get signal again. Maybe the light would help me find my way back. I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. A branch cracking, leaves moving. I kept turning the flashlight on and off, trying not to waste the battery. But I couldn't relax. My mind kept playing tricks on me, thinking I heard footsteps, thinking I saw shadows. But there was nothing, just fear. When the sun came up, I got up and started walking again. My legs were stiff. My throat was dry. I rationed what was left of my water, taking small sips every hour. I still had no signal. The GPS wouldn't load. I tried to remember the shape of the loop, the way it curved. I tried to find patterns in the trees, but it all looked the same. By noon, I knew I was in trouble. I had gone in circles. I found the same rock I passed 2 hours earlier. I recognized the bark pattern on a tree I saw before. I wasn't moving forward. I was just going around. Then I heard something. Not a person, not a voice. It was water. It was faint, like a small stream trickling over rocks. I turned and followed the sound. It took about 20 minutes of walking, but I found it. A narrow stream, about a foot wide, running over pebbles and roots. I dropped to my knees and filled my bottle. I had water. That was good, but I didn't know where it led. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead to a bigger body of water, maybe a river, maybe a place where someone had camped. But the stream twisted and bent and disappeared under the earth in some spots. I followed it until it widened and flowed into a small ravine. The rocks were slick. I tried to climb down, but my foot slipped. I fell forward, catching myself with my hands, but my knee smashed into a rock. The pain was sharp and instant. I sat there, breathing hard, afraid to move. When I finally did, I could put weight on the leg, but just barely. My knee was swollen and throbbing. I tore a piece of cloth from my shirt and wrapped it around, trying to hold it in place. I couldn't walk fast after that. I limped. Every step sent pain through my leg. I kept going, but slower. I kept thinking about how far I had gone, how far I still had to go. If anyone would even think to look for me. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going. That was the worst part. I always hiked alone. People were used to it. No one would think anything was wrong if I didn't come back for a day or two. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a location. I just left. By the second night, I was exhausted. I found another spot to sleep, this time under. I had hiked alone plenty of times before. I wasn't reckless. I always made sure to take extra food, water, a power bank, a first aid kit, and a printed map in case the GPS failed. I stuck to trails that were known, I checked the weather, and I always told someone where I was going. That time was no different. I planned a 3-day hike up into a forested range that crossed through a lightly used section of a national forest about 4 hours from where I lived. The trail wasn't exactly popular, but it was marked and had a reputation for being quiet and beautiful, nothing too dangerous. I drove out early on a Friday morning, parked my car at the small gravel pull-off next to the trailhead, and locked everything up tight. The sun was still rising. Everything looked calm. The trail stretched out in front of me, just dirt and pine needles under a long corridor of trees. The air smelled like dry bark and cool air. I took a photo of my car's location and sent it to my brother, like I always did. I didn't have any goal in particular. I just wanted to hike about 12 to 15 miles in, find a nice spot to set up camp near the creek that ran parallel to the trail, then relax for the night. The second day, I'd do a little loop deeper in and then circle back toward my car on the third day. The first 6 or 7 miles were peaceful. I didn't see anyone, which was expected. The trail was narrow in some places, and parts of it had low tree cover that made the light filter in soft and dappled. I liked that kind of environment. It felt separate from the rest of the world. No traffic, no talking, just the sound of wind rustling through leaves, an occasional bird call, the crunch of my boots. Around the 9th mile, things started feeling off. There's no dramatic way to explain it. The trail just didn't seem right. It was hard to describe. Maybe it was how quiet everything suddenly got. No birds, no bugs, just silence, dead air. I kept going though. I figured I was just being weird. I'd probably camp around mile 12. But somewhere near that 12th mile, I missed a marker. I should have realized it when the trail started to feel less like a trail and more like packed down wild land. The undergrowth was thicker. The brush scratched my pants more often. Rocks were more frequent. Still, there was enough of a path to follow that I convinced myself it was the same route. I told myself maybe this part of the trail was just less maintained. That made sense, right? I kept walking. It wasn't until I crossed a dry stream bed that I realized something was wrong. The creek I'd planned to camp near was supposed to run with water this time of year. I looked at the printed map, and it didn't match what I was seeing. The trees were right, mostly pine, but the contours of the land didn't fit. I walked in circles for a bit trying to find a marker or familiar path, but there were none. The light was starting to shift. It was later than I thought. I decided to set up camp and figure things out in the morning. The ground was hard and sloped slightly, but I found a flat enough spot beside a fallen log. I cleared away some rocks, set up my one-person tent, boiled some water for a dehydrated meal, and tried to calm my nerves. The trees creaked a little in the wind as the sun went down, but that was normal. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag early, trying to shake the feeling that I'd messed up. That night, I barely slept. I heard sounds, not animal sounds, not movement, but sounds that didn't quite belong, like something hollow tapping against wood. Once I heard a thump, just once. I told myself it was a pine cone falling, but it had weight to it. Something about it just didn't sit right. I stayed inside my tent and didn't move. When morning finally came, I unzipped the flap and saw mist floating low across the ground. The trees were wet with dew. The air was cold. I stood up and stretched, feeling stiff. I ate a bar and got moving. I figured I'd backtrack and try to retrace my steps. I thought it would be easy. It wasn't. The trail I had walked in on was gone. I don't mean it had faded. I mean it was gone. Just brush and random patches of dirt. No footprints, no markings, nothing that looked familiar. I walked in the direction I thought I had come from, based on the sun and the slope of the land, but after a few hours I realized I was even more lost. That's when I made another mistake. Instead of stopping and staying put like you're supposed to, I thought I could bushwhack my way down the slope toward a lower elevation and find the creek. That was my new plan. Find water, follow it downstream. That would eventually lead to a road or campsite or ranger station. The land got rougher. The trees were dense and close together. Dead branches clawed at my jacket. I slipped more than once. One time I caught myself on a rock and cut my palm open. Nothing deep, but it bled steadily. I wrapped it with a gauze strip from the first aid kit. My legs were burning. I kept going. Then I heard movement. Something was near me. At first I thought it was a deer. The brush shifted about 20 feet to my right. I froze and waited to see a body, an animal, anything. Nothing came out. I walked faster. Every so often, I'd stop and listen. The sound would start again. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving through the brush slowly. Not crashing, not running, just moving, quietly, keeping pace. I started calling out. Not for help. I knew there wasn't anyone around, but just to make noise. Just to let it know I knew it was there. Still, no response. Nothing moved when I spoke. But when I started walking again, I'd hear it too. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted. I hadn't found the creek. I hadn't found anything. I stopped to drink some water and leaned against a tree. My arms were scratched. My boots were wet. My mind felt foggy. The air smelled strange, damp, almost moldy. I heard something snap. Close this time. I didn't turn around. I just started walking faster. Then I made the worst decision I've ever made. I ran. I don't know why. Something clicked in me. Something primal. I just dropped everything except my pack and bolted through the trees like an idiot. My feet slapped the dirt and roots. Branches scraped my arms. I almost tripped 3 times. I didn't stop running for what felt like forever. When I did stop, everything was spinning. I had no idea where I was. My chest was burning. I dropped to my knees and almost threw up. I was sweating even though it was cold. Then I looked around. I had run into a clearing, a wide, flat patch of ground with nothing in it except a half-collapsed wooden structure about 30 feet across. It looked like it had once been a shed or shack. The wood was dark and rotted. The roof had holes. The door was hanging open. And for some reason, I went inside. I told myself it might give me shelter or a vantage point. I don't know. I just didn't want to be outside. The air felt wrong. Inside was dusty, and the floor creaked when I stepped. There was broken furniture. An old table, a bench missing a leg, what looked like the frame of a bed with rotted blankets still draped over it. No glass in the windows. I sat down on the bench and tried to breathe. I stayed there for over an hour, just listening. That's when I heard it again, movement. Outside, closer than before. It circled the building slowly. I held my breath. I didn't move. My knife was in my backpack. Not on me. I hadn't expected to need it. Then I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. A sniff. It sniffed, like something with a nose. It was right outside one of the windows. I didn't look. I just froze. It sniffed again. Then it moved away. I waited another 30 minutes, then quietly opened my pack and pulled out the knife. It wasn't big, but it was sharp. I held it close and peeked outside. Nothing. The forest was still. I waited until nightfall. Then I moved. I didn't sleep. I just walked. No flashlight. I let the moon guide me. Every now and then I heard it behind me. Never running. Just following. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just moved. My whole body hurt. Around sunrise, I found a set of tire tracks in the dirt. Real, fresh tire tracks. Probably from a maintenance truck or a ranger. I followed them. They led me to a gravel road. It was still hours before I saw a cabin. A real one this time. An old trail use building, still in use by the Forestry Service. It had a radio. They called someone. They got me out. I didn't tell them everything. I told them I got lost and followed the wrong drainage. They nodded. It happens. They didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't slept in 2 days. They didn't ask why my hands shook when I drank the water they gave me. They didn't ask why I didn't want to be alone in the back room while we waited for the truck to come. I haven't been hiking since. I still don't know what followed me. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was just my mind breaking down, but it was there. And I know it wasn't a dream, because the cut on my hand is still there. And sometimes at night, I still hear it sniffing. I started hiking alone more often after I moved to a quieter part of the state. I didn't know many people around, and I didn't feel the need to. I was tired of the noise, the rush, the pressure of always being surrounded by traffic, people, or constant phone notifications. I wanted to get away from all that. My work allowed it. I worked online, kept to myself, and planned long hikes on weekends. It was early fall when I decided to try a trail I hadn't done before. The weather was just starting to cool, and the trees were already changing color, especially at higher elevations. I remember the morning clearly. It was one of those quiet ones where the light comes in soft through the trees, and everything feels fresh, but not cold yet. I had packed a 35-liter day pack with a hydration bladder, some dry food, protein bars, a flashlight, knife, emergency blanket, a windbreaker, and a paper map in a Ziploc bag. I had cell reception in parts of the mountain, but not all of it, and I didn't want to rely on that. My battery was full. Everything seemed like it was going to be a good day. The trailhead was about an hour from my cabin. It was at a remote parking lot that only had room for about 4 cars. When I got there around 7 a.m., no one else was parked. I saw no fresh tire tracks either. I liked that. I always liked being the only one on the trail. Less noise, more space to think. The plan was to hike a loop called Wolf Jaw Ridge. It was supposed to be about 16 miles total, not an easy trail, but not technical either. Most of the hike followed a ridge line after the first steep climb, and then curved down a long valley, finally looping back to the trailhead along a river. According to the old paper map I carried, some parts of the trail weren't maintained as regularly as the others, but that didn't bother me. I had good boots and had done worse. The climb up the first part of the ridge was rough. I had to scramble a little over loose rocks and step over wet roots, and at some point I had to stop to wipe my glasses because the humidity had fogged them up. The sun was just starting to filter through the tall trees, and patches of golden light were breaking across the forest floor. The trail markings were clear for the most part, faded blue paint on bark and small cairns at the wider sections. I took my time, sipped water every 20 minutes, and checked my map often. Once I got to the ridge line, everything opened up. There were clearings where I could see for miles. Forested hills, some bare rock faces, the dark blue stretch of a lake far in the valley below. The air was cooler up there, and the wind had picked up slightly, but I wasn't cold. I ate a protein bar, adjusted the straps on my backpack, and moved on. The path got narrower as it followed the spine of the ridge. Sometimes the drop-offs were steep on either side, but the trail never felt dangerous, just narrow. It snaked along the ridge for what felt like hours. The forest was quiet. I heard only the wind in the trees and the occasional dry crunch of squirrels moving in the underbrush below. I had that strange but welcome feeling of being far away from everything. No cars, no voices, no other hikers. Around noon, clouds began to form. I checked the sky. The forecast hadn't mentioned rain, but I knew how quickly mountain weather could change. The clouds were light gray, moving fast, but not dark enough to worry me yet. I picked up my pace slightly, not because I was scared, but because I didn't want to deal with soaked gear later. That's when I reached the fork. It wasn't marked on my map, and there was no signpost, but there it was, an old split in the trail. The left fork continued along the ridge, wide and clearly used. The right one was thinner, more overgrown, heading down at an angle into denser woods. It looked older, less traveled. Someone had placed 2 small stones on the left trail side, like a lazy marker, but there was no writing, no carved sign. I paused, pulled out the map again, and looked hard at the section where I thought I was. The map didn't show a fork here, only a long, curved path along the ridge. I should have ignored the right trail. It didn't feel right from the beginning, but I stood there a while, staring down that narrow path, wondering where it led. Maybe it was an older route that had been removed from newer maps, or maybe it was a shortcut to the valley. Couldn't tell. I figured I'd take it for just half a mile, and if it seemed off, I turned back. The first part of it descended fast, with soft pine needles and moss underfoot. It was quieter here, no wind. The trees pressed in tighter, and the air smelled more like soil and damp leaves. The trail was barely a trail anymore, just a faint depression in the forest floor. I kept moving carefully, marking some trees with broken branches as I went. After 10 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen another cairn or marker since the fork. That's when the trail vanished completely. I stopped, looked around. Everything looked the same in every direction. The trees were thick, the undergrowth was dense, and the slope continued downward. I tried retracing my steps, but the ground cover made it hard to see where I'd come from. I looked for my broken branch markers, but I couldn't find a single one. Either I had missed them or the forest had swallowed them in seconds. Still, I wasn't panicked. I had been in worse spots. I pulled out the map again, tried to locate myself by elevation and direction. The trouble was, without a clear view of the sun and no GPS signal now, I couldn't be exactly sure. I took a guess based on the slope and headed in what I thought was west. I walked for what must have been 2 hours, trying to go in a straight line. But the forest wasn't letting me. I kept having to curve around thick growth, fallen logs, patches of wet ground that sucked at my boots. I started sweating more than I should have in that cool air. My legs were getting tired. I hadn't eaten again, and I didn't want to stop. I felt the first tiny stab of fear right then, but I pushed it down. Then I found the first deer carcass. It was fresh. Its body was mostly intact, but its belly had been torn open, the ribs exposed. Flies already buzzed around it, and the eyes were still wet. No smell yet. I backed away slowly, checked the ground around me, and moved past it. Could have been a coyote, could have been a bear. I didn't want to think about that too much. I just kept moving. 10 minutes later, I found another one. This time, it was just bones scattered in a wide pattern. The skull had been cracked. And again, there was no clear trail nearby. No predator tracks that I could see, just bones. I felt my heartbeat faster in my chest. I didn't want to stop walking. That's when I realized I had been hearing something faint in the distance. A noise that didn't fit the rest of the forest. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't running water. It was a metallic sound. Repetitive. A short clink. Then silence. Then another clink. Like metal on metal. I turned slowly, trying to figure out the direction. Couldn't tell. The trees were too thick, and the sound didn't echo right. I moved away from it. I started climbing again. Up the side of the slope now, through brush and uneven rock. I tore my pants on a thorn bush. My left boot caught under a root, and I almost went face first into the dirt. I pulled myself up slowly, panting. My water was low now. I stopped to sip what was left. That's when I saw the shack. It was small, falling apart, maybe the size of a tool shed. The wood was rotted on the lower edges, and one side leaned against a tree. There was no path to it, no sign of any trail nearby. It looked abandoned, like it had been built a long time ago and forgotten. The door was gone, just a dark entrance. I stepped closer, cautiously. I didn't want to go in, but I wanted to see if there was anything useful inside. A trail sign, a name, anything. Inside were two things: an old metal drum and a camping stove that looked rusted through. No sleeping bag, no trash, no signs of recent use. But there was something else, scratch marks on the inside wall. Deep, wide ones. Not from an animal, from a blade or something heavy. They were all over the back wall, straight lines, crossing each other. That was enough. I turned and left, heart pounding. I didn't want to be there when the clinking sound came back. The forest felt tighter now. Every direction looked wrong. The shadows were longer. The wind was gone completely. I checked my phone, no signal. The battery was down to 48%. I kept moving uphill until the slope ended and I reached a flat stretch. There I saw what I thought was a trail. It was an old logging road, half reclaimed by the forest, but straight enough to follow. I took it, hoping it would lead somewhere, anywhere that made sense. I walked for another hour before I saw the fence. It was tall, barbed at the top, and ran both directions far into the trees. No signs, no gate, just a rusted metal fence in the middle of nowhere. Beyond it, The land dipped steeply into a ravine. I followed the fence right for 20 minutes and found nothing. I followed it left, and after a while, the road ended entirely. I had to make a choice. Go down the ravine and hope it connected to something, or stay by the fence and try to backtrack. I left home early in the morning. The sky was still dark, and the streetlights were the only things lighting up the road as I drove out of town. I had planned this hike for a while. It wasn't one of those tourist spots with maps at every turn. It was a remote area, about a 2-hour drive from where I lived. The place didn't even have a name I could remember, just coordinates I had saved on my phone and a trail someone on a forum had mentioned months ago. It was supposed to be quiet, challenging, and untouched. That was exactly what I wanted. I had packed my bag the night before: water, food, a first aid kit, my old compass, a power bank, a small knife, a rain jacket, and a flashlight. I even brought some paracord and a lighter. I was feeling proud of myself for being so prepared. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, which now I realize was my first mistake. At the time, I thought it didn't matter. I had my phone. I had my gear. I had done this kind of thing before. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had started coming up. The sky turned pale blue, and I could see the peaks in the distance. The dirt path looked barely touched, with patches of grass and weeds growing across it. I locked the car, threw the backpack over my shoulder, and started walking. For the first 2 hours, everything felt perfect. The path climbed steadily, and the morning air was cool. Birds were chirping. I saw a few deer in the distance. I stopped once or twice to drink water and snap a few photos of the view. There was no cell service, but I didn't care. I had GPS downloaded offline. The trail was clear enough. I followed it without trouble. I passed a dry creek bed around mid-morning and kept going, heading up toward a ridge that looked promising. The higher I got, the more beautiful it became. Pines lined both sides of the slope, and the wind made a low whooshing sound through them. Everything smelled like dirt and needles and sun-warmed stone. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, like I had finally escaped the noise of the world. Around noon, I stopped for a snack on a flat rock near a bend in the trail. I sat there for 20 minutes or so, just listening and resting. That's when I made my second mistake. There was a side path, barely visible, that veered off to the left. It looked more rugged, but it pointed toward a rock outcrop I had seen from below and wanted to check out. I didn't think twice. I figured I'd follow it up for a bit and then loop back down. It didn't seem that far. At first, the new path was manageable, steep but still passable. I climbed up some loose dirt and stones, holding onto tree roots when I had to. After maybe 15 minutes, I started noticing that the trail was less of a trail and more just patches of broken ground between rocks. There were no footprints, no signs anyone had been through recently. But I was already up pretty far, and the view behind me was incredible. I figured I'd go just a little farther. Another 10 minutes, and I hit a wide, sloping rock face. It stretched up at an angle toward the outcrop. There were patches of moss and small handholds. It didn't seem too bad. I took my time, moving carefully, checking my footing. The rock was dry, the sun was warm. I made it up without slipping. But once I got to the top, everything changed. The outcrop was there, but the slope beyond it dropped sharply into a valley I hadn't seen on the map. The trees below looked much denser, darker, and the terrain rougher than where I had come from. I turned to head back the way I came, but I couldn't see the path anymore. Everything below just looked like trees and rocks and dirt. No clear trail, no familiar markers. I climbed back down the rock slope, slowly, retracing my steps. But the ground didn't look the same. I realized then that I had no idea where I had come up. I pulled out my phone. No signal. I opened the offline GPS. The blue dot was there, but it wasn't much help. The paths weren't marked, and the satellite view was just a blur of green and brown. I tried to orient myself with the compass, figure out which way I had come from. I guessed south. That was probably wrong. Still, I started walking in what I thought was the right direction, trying to keep my cool. I stopped every few minutes to look around, trying to find something familiar. But everything started to look the same. Pines, rocks, uneven ground. No sounds except the wind and the occasional bird. After about an hour of walking, I realized I was completely lost. Panic didn't hit me all at once. It crept in slowly, like a cold breeze. I kept telling myself I'd find the trail again, that I just needed to go a little farther. But the sun was starting to slide across the sky. I could feel time slipping past me, and I hadn't seen a single sign of the way back. I stopped and drank some water. I tried to stay calm. I sat on a log and took out the map I had printed out as a backup, but it didn't help. It was too general, and the spot I had gone off trail wasn't marked. I started feeling a tightness in my chest, a dull pressure behind my eyes. I decided I needed to go downhill. Most trails follow contour lines and avoid steep valleys, so I thought if I could get to lower ground, I might find a real trail or at least a stream. Water sources usually led back to civilization eventually. That was my thinking. But going downhill was harder than I thought. The slope was steep, and the ground was soft in places. I slid a few times. My legs were starting to get tired. I kept walking, following the sound of what I thought was running water. I finally found a stream just before sunset, a thin one cutting between some boulders. I refilled my water bottle, filtering it through a small pump I kept in my bag. I knew I needed to stop for the night. I didn't want to hike in the dark. I found a small clearing under some trees and set down my pack. I didn't have a tent, just a tarp and a light blanket. I laid them out on some pine needles, ate a protein bar, and tried to settle in. That night was the longest I'd ever spent outside. The cold came fast. I wore all my layers, but it wasn't enough. My back ached from the ground. Every rustle in the woods made me flinch. I barely slept, just lay there listening to the wind move through the trees and my own breathing, shallow and quick. When morning came, I felt sore and tired, but the sky was clear. I ate another bar, packed up, and followed the stream. It twisted through tight gullies and over rocks. I had to jump and climb in places. I slipped at one point and banged my knee hard on a stone. It swelled up quickly, making it painful to walk, but I had no choice. I kept going. Hours passed. I kept hoping I'd see a bridge or a campsite or even a trail marker, but there was nothing, just endless forest. My water ran low again, so I filtered more. My knee was throbbing. Every step became harder. I started leaning on a stick I had picked up, using it like a crutch. By the third day, things got worse. I had run out of food. I had 2 granola bars left, and I ate them sparingly. My knee had stiffened overnight. I had made a basic shelter using the tarp tied between 2 trees, but it didn't keep out the cold or bugs. I woke up shaking, with bites on my neck and arms. My stomach growled constantly, and I had to sit down more often. My body was starting to feel weaker. Still, I kept walking during the day, following the stream which had gotten wider. That was the only good sign. If it got bigger, it meant it was going somewhere, maybe toward a river, maybe a road. But even as I followed it, I had to take longer rests. My knee couldn't take the downhill slopes anymore. I wrapped it in part of my shirt, tied tight, but it didn't help much. On the 5th day, I saw something that almost made me cry. A rusted metal sign, bent and partly buried in the dirt. I dug it out. It had faint letters, most of them unreadable, but I could make out a part that said Mile 4. I didn't know what it meant, but it was man-made. That meant people had been here before. I followed the direction it faced. Not long after, I found an old fire ring, mostly covered in leaves. I knew then I wasn't completely alone. Someone had camped here at some point. I stopped and rested, lying down in the shade. My lips were dry, my legs trembling from hunger. Later that afternoon, I heard the first human sound in days. An engine far off, like a dirt bike or maybe a chainsaw. I tried to move faster, toward the sound, but the terrain was too rough. I screamed, even though I knew nobody could hear me from that far. I waved the flashlight in the air. The sound faded before I got close. That broke me a little. I sat down and cried, my face in my hands, breathing hard, the woods silent around me. I felt like I had disappeared from the world. I wasn't sure how many days I had been out there anymore. My watch had died. My phone was dead too. I started thinking I might not make it, But the next morning I found tire tracks. They were faint, half covered by pine needles, but they were real. I followed them for hours, dragging my injured leg behind me. The trail twisted and dipped, and more than once I lost the tracks and had to backtrack. But I kept going. Then, sometime in the afternoon, I heard a truck. A real engine, low and steady. I limped toward the sound, and it started with the need to get away from everything. I had taken 2 weeks off work because my head wasn't right. I didn't want to be around people, cars, or noise. I wanted something quiet, natural, something that didn't move fast or ask anything from me. So I packed my hiking gear, stuffed my old army backpack with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, cooking stuff, first aid, 2 knives, a compass, waterproof maps, and just enough food to make it through a week, and I drove up north toward the mountains. There's a stretch of forest land near the Canadian border that's remote and mostly untouched. Few people hike up that far because it's out of the way and the terrain gets difficult fast. That's exactly what I wanted. Somewhere wild enough that I wouldn't run into anyone, where my phone would stay silent because of no signal, and the only sounds would be wind in the trees or maybe a river somewhere below. I parked my car just off a logging road that was barely even marked. It was muddy from the rain that had hit the night before, and my tires kicked up thick clumps of it as I pulled off into a clearing. I left a note on my dashboard with the date and my intended route, just in case, and locked up. My boots hit the trail just past 7 a.m., and the first few hours were perfect. I followed a narrow trail that eventually disappeared into the brush, and I didn't bother keeping to it. I had my map and compass, and I knew how to read terrain. I'd done solo hikes before, this was nothing new. By noon, I was deep into the forest. The air smelled like pine needles and wet bark. I crossed a few small creeks, stepped carefully around some slick rocks, and found a clearing to set up my camp for the first night. I boiled some water, ate some dried beef and instant rice, then rolled out my sleeping bag and lay there listening to the forest get quiet as the sun went down. That first night was uneventful. Some rustling now and then, maybe a raccoon or a deer moving through the woods. I slept light, like I usually do out in the wild, waking at the smallest noise, but nothing ever came too close. The second day, I followed my planned route northwest. My goal was to reach a ridge where I could get a good view of the valley beyond. According to the map, a river ran along the base of that valley, and it eventually snaked westward toward a few old, overgrown trails that would circle me back toward the road where I'd parked. It was a 7-day loop if I kept a steady pace. Around midday, I reached a steep slope covered in loose gravel and patches of slick moss. I had to crouch and take it slow, planting each step firmly before shifting my weight. At the bottom was a wide, slow-moving river, calm and shallow, flowing gently west. That was the river I had seen on the map. It looked beautiful in the sunlight, the water clear enough to see fish darting through it. I decided to follow it for the next leg of the hike, using it as a natural guide. The terrain was tricky near the water. The riverbanks were steep in places, sometimes layered with sharp rocks or thick roots. I slipped a couple of times, but nothing serious. I filtered some water into my bottle, took a long drink, and continued on. By the third day, I noticed things getting rough. The river had turned narrow and fast, carving deeper into the land. Trees leaned over it like they were trying to hide it. The slope beside it steepened. I realized I was lower in elevation than I should have been, and I'd probably gone off course. I checked my compass and tried to realign with the map, but something didn't sit right. The landmarks I had marked weren't lining up. I didn't panic, but I got that feeling deep in my gut, that something wasn't right and I needed to correct it fast. I decided to climb uphill and try to get a better view, hoping to see a ridge or peak I could match with my map. The climb took longer than expected. Thick brush slowed me down, and the incline forced me to rest more often than I wanted. I hadn't seen any sign of wildlife all day, not even birds, which made the woods feel quiet in a wrong kind of way. When I reached the top of the hill, I didn't see any recognizable landmarks, just trees and more hills stretching out endlessly. I took out my compass again. The needle spun for a second before settling. I turned in place, trying to align myself, but nothing added up. That night, I made camp again, But sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up to tiny sounds. The snap of a twig, leaves rustling when there was no wind. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but the sounds felt intentional, like something stepping slowly, carefully. I gripped my knife tight in my sleeping bag, listening to my heartbeat pound in my ears. I finally drifted off just before dawn. On the fourth day, I decided I needed to stop following the river. It had led me too far off course. I turned east, trying to cut across the forest and regain my original loop. The hike became harder. The undergrowth was thicker, and the hills seemed to roll on forever. At one point, I climbed a ridge that looked promising, only to find another valley beyond it with more trees and no clear direction. I rationed my food more tightly that day. I hadn't seen any signs of other hikers, no fire rings, no cut trails, nothing. It was starting to dawn on me how far off-grid I had gone. My phone, of course, still had no signal. I tried climbing a dead tree for a better view and slipped halfway up, slicing my arm on a broken branch. Blood soaked into my sleeve. I cleaned it with what water I had and wrapped it tight. It wasn't deep, but it stung like hell. I came across a dry stream bed in the afternoon and followed it, hoping it would lead me back toward the river where I could reorient myself. The rocks underfoot were slick with moss and algae, and I fell twice, once hard enough to bruise my ribs. I didn't realize it then, but my breathing was more shallow after that. On the fifth day, everything started to feel wrong. I was tired, sore, and dehydrated. My food was nearly gone, and I hadn't had a good night's sleep since I started. I kept thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped, there was nothing. The woods felt too quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just me and the crackle of twigs underfoot. I came across an old, broken-down hunting stand. It was half-rotted and covered in moss, the latter missing several rungs. I climbed halfway up and sat there, eating the last of my trail mix. From that high point, I finally saw a line of cliffs in the far distance, jagged and sharp, glowing orange in the setting sun. I couldn't match them with anything on my map, but it was the only thing that stood out, so I marked their direction in my mind. That night, I didn't set up camp. I just laid my sleeping bag between two trees and tried to rest. I kept hearing something moving through the trees. Slow steps, then silence. Then again, closer. I held my breath and listened for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have passed out. On the sixth day, I woke up to find deep scratches on a tree near where I had slept. 3 long marks running down the trunk, too wide for any common animal. I stared at them for a long time. I don't know why, but I didn't even feel fear anymore. Just this heavy sense that something was wrong with this place. Like the land didn't want me here. I pushed toward the cliffs, hoping that direction would take me closer to something familiar. I walked for hours with no clear path, just forcing my way through thick brush, tearing my pants and cutting my hands on sharp branches. The cliffs never seemed to get closer. By midday, I had to stop. My legs were shaking from fatigue. I drank the last of my water and sat down against a tree. That's when I noticed a smell. Faint at first, but getting stronger, something rotting. I stood up, looking around, and followed the scent. After about 50 feet, I saw it, half a deer torn apart and left to rot. Its rib cage was exposed, flies buzzing everywhere, and its eyes were gone. The cuts on it didn't look like a normal predator. They were too clean, too deliberate. I turned and walked away fast, heart pounding in my ears. Later that afternoon, it started to rain. Cold, steady rain that soaked everything. I slipped twice on muddy slopes and twisted my ankle the second time. The pain shot through my leg like fire. I couldn't put full weight on it, but I didn't have a choice. I had to keep moving. I hobbled for hours, not even sure what direction I was going anymore. I started shouting, hoping maybe someone would hear me, even though I knew how pointless that was. No one was out here. No one could hear me. I felt like I was walking in circles. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a tree, holding my knife, jumping at every sound. The forest never went quiet. There were noises all night. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, water splashing in the distance. I didn't see anything, but I knew something was nearby, watching. On the seventh morning, I couldn't walk anymore. My ankle had swollen up so badly I could barely stand. I crawled for a while, using a stick as a crutch, dragging my leg behind me. I was soaked, hungry, and freezing. I knew I had to do something drastic. I pulled out my emergency whistle and started blowing it in bursts, hoping against all hope someone might hear it. I did it again every 10 minutes for the next few hours. My lips were cracked and dry, my hands shaking. I leaned against a rock and stared at the tree. I've always liked being alone in the woods. It's not that I don't enjoy people, but there's something about being out in the wild that makes me feel real again. Clean, simple. For a few days, there's no noise except for wind through the trees. No phones ringing, no messages to reply to. Just me, my backpack, a trail, and the slow rhythm of my breathing as I climb higher into quiet places. This story happened in late September last year. I took some time off work and decided to do a solo hike in Montana. I chose a less popular trail that looped through forest, crossed a couple of creeks, and circled around an isolated mountain lake before reconnecting to the trailhead about 30 miles later. It wasn't totally off-grid, but it wasn't the kind of trail where you'd see a bunch of people either. I parked my old Subaru at a small dirt lot where the trail started. There were no other cars around. The weather looked good, clear skies, dry ground, mid-60s during the day. Nights were colder, but I'd packed my cold-rated sleeping bag and thermal clothes, so I wasn't too worried. I set off mid-morning with my backpack snug, my boots laced tight, and my GPS tracker fully charged. I didn't plan to use my phone much, just GPS and emergency check-ins. I had a paper map too, just in case. The trail was beautiful the first day. The trees were just starting to turn yellow and red, and the leaves on the ground made a soft crunching sound under my boots. A couple hours in, I stopped to watch a moose from a distance as it wandered near a stream. Later, I saw a bald eagle take off from a high branch. It felt good to be out there. I set up camp near a small clearing that night, maybe 10 miles in, and slept peacefully. The second day started fine too. The trail got steeper and I crossed into more rugged territory. Tall rocks, thicker woods, fewer signs of human activity. No wrappers on the trail, no footprints, no broken branches that looked like someone had come through recently. I liked it that way. Around mid-afternoon, I came to a fork in the trail. One path was marked on my map, but the other wasn't. The unmarked trail wasn't exactly hidden. It looked like it had been used before, maybe by hunters or rangers. Something about it felt off, though. The way the brush was cleared along the sides, how the ground was packed a little too evenly. But I didn't think much of it. I stuck to the main trail, the one on my map, and kept moving. Later that day, I found a flat patch of ground near a cliffside with a view of the forest below. I set up camp there, ate a meal of dehydrated rice and beans, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. The stars came out one by one, and I felt that familiar peace I always found when I was out in nature. I went to sleep without a worry. The third day is when things changed. I woke up early, packed up, and started moving again. The trail narrowed, winding through thick pine trees and rising slightly toward a ridge. Around noon, I stopped to refill my water bottles at a small creek. That's when I saw it. A tire track, a single track partly pressed into the soft dirt near the water. It wasn't from a mountain bike either. This was from something wider, maybe an ATV or a small 4x4 vehicle. But this part of the forest wasn't supposed to allow motor vehicles. No service roads showed up on my map, and even if someone did sneak in, getting a vehicle this far would be difficult. I crouched and examined it. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Maybe a day or two at most. I started to get a weird feeling, but I told myself it was probably a ranger or hunter with a special permit. I moved on, but I kept my eyes open more. About 2 hours later, I noticed the forest felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. There were no birds chirping, no rustling from squirrels or rabbits. Even the wind had died down. Everything felt stale. I kept walking, slower now, glancing around every few seconds. I started to notice signs, small ones. A piece of red string tied to a tree branch, a metal can tucked under some rocks. a cigarette but next to a mossy log. None of it fit with the natural setting. Then I smelled something. Chemicals. Faint, but noticeable. A sour, synthetic smell like burnt plastic or cleaning products. Came in short bursts depending on the wind. I followed the trail for another 10 minutes and stopped dead in my tracks. Ahead of me, just barely visible through the trees, was a clearing. Inside it stood a small wooden shed, old gray, with a blue tarp half draped over the roof. Nearby were black barrels, plastic containers, and something that looked like a generator. I dropped to one knee behind a fallen tree and watched. There was no sound, but a thin column of smoke was rising from behind the shed. Not a campfire. This was steady, thin, almost industrial looking. I stayed low, heart thudding. The pieces clicked together quickly in my mind. I'd heard of remote grow operations or meth labs being hidden deep in forests. People cooking drugs out in the middle of nowhere to avoid police detection. Suddenly, I realized how bad this could be. If I stumbled onto something illegal, the people running it might not let me walk away. I was alone, no cell signal, no backup. Nobody would hear me scream out here. I backed away slowly, trying not to snap any branches. My boots were quiet on the soft dirt. I moved back down the trail, careful to stay low. I made it about 30 feet when I heard something behind me. Rustling. Footsteps. I didn't turn around. I stepped off the trail and crouched behind a large fallen tree, heart pounding. I stayed frozen for at least 5 minutes, barely breathing. I finally dared to peek back through the brush. A man walked by on the trail. He was wearing camo pants, a black hoodie, and gloves. He had a rifle slung across his chest and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. He wasn't hunting. He was patrolling. I stayed hidden until he disappeared from view, then waited another 10 minutes. My body was stiff from staying crouched so long. When I finally moved, I stayed off the trail entirely. I took a wide arc through the woods, using my compass and GPS to get back on the official trail, far past where the shed had been. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and I hadn't drank much water either. I found a spot far from the trail, deeper into the trees, and set up my tent quickly, just before full dark. I didn't use my headlamp, just felt around in the dim light. I didn't cook, didn't eat. I lay in my bag fully dressed, clutching my knife, listening for sounds all night. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I packed fast and started moving before the sun was fully up. I had about 12 miles left before I reached the trailhead, but I didn't feel safe until I was back in my car. I moved fast, almost jogging in some places. I stayed off the marked trail at times, afraid someone might be waiting along it. Then something happened that made things worse. Around late morning, I crossed a small hill and found footprints, fresh ones, 2 sets, both booted, large sizes, and both leading in the same direction I was going. They weren't mine. The tread pattern didn't match. They looked like they'd been made maybe an hour before I got there, which meant someone else was nearby and going the same way I was. I didn't know if they were rangers, hunters, or part of the group I'd accidentally found. I just knew I didn't want to find out. I cut off trail again, moving parallel to the original path, staying hidden. Slowed me down, but I felt safer. Around 2 p.m., I stopped to drink and eat a little trail mix. My hands were shaking. I kept looking around like someone was watching. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I saw movement in the trees behind me, a flash of a dark jacket. Then I heard the crack of a branch. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted downhill, barely watching where I stepped. My backpack bounced hard against my back. Branches slapped my face. I didn't care. I had to get out. I saw the parking lot ahead like a light at the end of a tunnel. My car was still there. I fumbled the keys out of my pocket while running, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. As I started the engine and backed out, I looked in the rearview mirror. A figure stepped out of the trees, standing still at the edge of the lot, just watching. Then I turned the corner and lost sight of him. I drove straight to the nearest town, 25 miles away. I pulled into a gas station, went inside, locked myself in the bathroom, and threw up. Later, I went to the sheriff's office and reported what I saw. The deputy asked questions, took notes, and said they'd send someone to check it out. I could tell by his face he wasn't surprised. Maybe they already knew something was going on in that area. Or maybe they didn't want to poke the hornet's nest. I never got a follow-up. Since then, I haven't gone hiking alone. Not because I stopped loving the woods, but because now I understand something I didn't before. There are parts of the forest where people go to get away from the world. And not everyone goes there for peace. Some go there to hide, to do things in the dark, things they don't want others to see. And if you accidentally see it, it started on a Thursday morning in mid-September. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks. I picked a section of trail in Idaho that didn't get much foot traffic, no famous name, no Instagram fame, no parking lot maps. Just a remote trail that cut through national forest land near the border with Montana. I found it online in an old blog post, and I picked it because the elevation change looked challenging, and I wanted to push myself. I wanted to get away from everything, especially after what the last few months had been like. I had just gone through a breakup, work had been burning me out, and I felt like I was rotting inside from screens and city noise. So I packed my gear, took a week off work, and drove out by myself. The trailhead was about 10 miles from the nearest town. I drove up a rough gravel road and parked in a clearing with nothing but a rotted wooden post that had no markings on it anymore. From there, I locked my car, put the key in my zipped inner jacket pocket, and started hiking. I was planning a 3-day trip, hike up into the ridges, make camp the first night somewhere near the switchbacks, then follow the trail around to a high lake, spend the second night there, and return the third day. I had a loaded 55-liter pack with my tent, food, filtration gear, bear spray, GPS unit, and paper topo map just in case. I had trained all summer for this. I was in good shape. I felt confident. The first hour on the trail was steep but peaceful. The air smelled like pine needles and cold rock. No one was out there. The trail was narrow and a little overgrown in spots, but it was clear enough to follow. By the third hour, the trail had started to climb more seriously, and the path zigzagged up a large hill. These were the switchbacks I had seen on the topo map, tight and steep. The trees thinned out here. The sun was strong. I stopped for a quick snack and water, then kept going. As I climbed, I started seeing signs that no one had been here in a while. A small tree had fallen across the path, and a few of the switchbacks were partly washed out. The trail narrowed so much in some places that I had to step carefully to avoid sliding down the slope. I figured the Forest Service hadn't maintained this section for a few years, which didn't surprise me. It was remote and not popular. As I made it about halfway up the switchbacks, I noticed something odd. A piece of metal half buried in the dirt off to the left. I stepped off the trail a bit and dug around it with a stick. It looked like the corner of an old sign. When I cleared more of the dirt away, I saw faded letters. It said trail closed in white, worn paint. There were no dates or details, just that. I stood there for a minute, wondering why it had been taken down. Maybe someone had tossed it or wind had knocked it off. But if the trail was closed, there was no way to know when or why. Could have been years ago. I almost turned around, but then I looked up. I could already see the top of the hill. I had come far enough and I didn't want to lose time. I figured I'd be extra careful and keep going. About another hour later, I finally reached the top of the switchbacks. There was a small plateau, scattered with rocks and low shrubs. From up there, I could see across a huge stretch of forest. Miles of dark green trees folded over each other, with patches of rock poking out like bones. I sat down, took my boots off, and let my feet breathe. I ate jerky, granola, and drank water. My shirt was soaked with sweat. The wind up there felt clean. Felt like I had reached some edge of the world. I set up my tent near a cluster of boulders. It was flat, dry, and gave me a little protection from the wind. I cleared the ground, pitched the tent, and set my bear canister a good distance away. I made sure to follow all the safety rules. I had done this kind of thing before. I wasn't careless. That night, it got cold fast. I crawled into my sleeping bag early. I didn't build a fire because I didn't want to draw attention, and also because the wind had picked up. It rattled my tent a little, and I could hear it brushing through the branches above. I lay there listening. I didn't hear animals. No rustling, no distant howls or hoots. Just the wind and silence. It was the kind of silence that you don't get back in cities. The kind that makes you think you've gone deaf. I woke up around 3 a.m. because I had to pee. I stepped outside the tent, boots unlaced, jacket zipped halfway. It was pitch dark except for the stars. No clouds. I did what I had to do and turned to go back in the tent. That's when I saw it. Down the slope, maybe a quarter-mile off, there was a small blinking light. It was red, just blinking, slow and steady, like a dying bike light. It was barely above the ground, maybe at waist level. Then it stopped. It didn't fade out. It just went dark. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, not moving. I told myself maybe it was a reflection from a plane, but it had looked too steady and low for that. It hadn't moved, just blinked and vanished. I went back inside the tent and lay down, but I didn't sleep much. I just stared at the nylon ceiling and waited for morning. When the sun came up, I got moving fast. I made instant coffee, packed my gear, and started back on the trail. I had planned to keep going deeper toward the lake, but something about that light had thrown me off. My stomach felt tight. My instinct told me not to keep going. I decided to go back the way I came, cut the trip short, and maybe find another trailhead nearby with better cell service. As I started down the switchbacks, I noticed something else that made my chest feel heavy. There were boot prints in the dirt that hadn't been there before. They were fresh. The tread was deep and sharp, like someone had come through during the night or early morning. They weren't mine. I had been the only one up. I checked the size. Smaller than my boots, but definitely an adult. The prints came from further up the trail and followed the same path I had taken. I kept moving. I didn't stop to eat. Every 20 minutes or so, I'd look behind me. The forest felt heavier. I was sweating more than I should have been. The air felt hotter, even though it was still early in the day. Then, somewhere near the middle section of the switchbacks, I found something that made me freeze. On the side of the trail, there was a sock. A single gray wool sock, wet with mud, balled up like it had been dropped in a hurry. Next to it was a plastic wrapper, some kind of protein bar I didn't recognize. I looked around. No noise, no birds, no wind. I didn't want to touch it, but I took a picture with my phone and kept walking faster. I started to get a dull pain in my chest that I couldn't explain. My stomach was tight. My mouth was dry even though I kept sipping from my water tube. I kept glancing behind me. The trail felt wrong, like it was stretching. The trees looked the same, but I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. An hour passed, then two. I should have been near the base of the switchbacks by then, but I wasn't. The trail looked the same, but I kept passing familiar rocks and down trees like I was stuck in a loop. I stopped and pulled out the map. I checked my GPS. Both said I was moving in the right direction, but it didn't feel like it. The signal kept cutting out. I took a break. I didn't eat. I just sat down and breathed slowly to stop my hands from shaking. That's when I heard it, sticks snapping somewhere down the slope to my right. It wasn't a bear. It sounded like footsteps. Then it stopped. I stood up and started walking again. I didn't run, but I walked fast. I kept one hand near the bear spray clipped to my belt. The light was starting to dim even though it wasn't late yet. The sky had turned gray, and clouds were sliding in. Eventually, I saw something that stopped me dead. A fire pit. A used one. Stones in a circle, black ash in the center with a few charred sticks. It wasn't mine. I had camped higher up. This was fresh. I walked closer and saw footprints around it. At least two different sizes. One was the same size as the ones I had seen earlier. The other was larger, deeper. There were bones in the fire pit. Small ones. Animal maybe rabbit or squirrel. I didn't stay to check. I turned around and kept moving. Finally, after what felt like half a day, I saw the edge of the gravel road in the distance. My car was there, but something was wrong. The driver's door was open. My chest started pounding. I had locked it. I knew I had. I ran toward it, heart racing. When I got there, I looked inside. Nothing was stolen, but the glove box was open. The keys were still in my jacket, zipped up. I got in, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. I turned the engine and drove, tires spinning on the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town an hour later. I went to a ranger station and told them everything. The sock, the fire pit, the prints, the open car. They sent someone out, but a week later I got a call saying they didn't find anything. No signs of other people, no footprints, no fire pit, not even the trail closure sign I had found. Just the trail, overgrown and empty. I don't hike alone anymore. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted. But someone had been watching me. That blinking red light, the sock, the footprints that followed mine down, the fire pit, the open door. I've always liked hiking. Not the social kind, not the kind where you go with a group and take selfies and bring a speaker to blast music at the top. I'm talking about solo hiking, just you, a heavy pack, and silence. There's something about it that pulls me in. It gives me space, a kind of peace I can't get in the city. I'm not the kind of guy who spends his weekend in clubs or restaurants. I'd rather be out in the woods, far away from people, away from roads, away from everything. It was late September. The weather was changing, cooler now. Trees were starting to turn. That week I had 4 days off. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just packed up and left. The plan was to hike into a quiet patch of forest in the northern part of the state, an area I had marked on Google Earth but never visited. I had read that it used to be a logging area back in the 60s. Not many people went there now. The main road didn't even show up on GPS anymore. But I liked that. I wanted isolation. I drove out early in the morning and reached the edge of the forest by noon. My truck was packed with gear. I had a heavy-duty backpack, extra food, water filters, maps, and a revolver just in case. I always carried one. It wasn't about paranoia. It was just a smart thing to do when you're hiking alone miles from help. I parked on a dirt patch at the edge of a narrow trail that barely looked used. Just twin-tire ruts running into the trees. The air was cool and damp, the kind of air that soaks into your clothes. I geared up, locked my truck, and started walking down the path. My plan was to follow the old logging road until I reached a point deep enough to make camp and then just explore the area slowly over the next 2 days. First, the trail was easy. The road, though overgrown, was still visible. Fallen leaves covered most of it, and grass was pushing through, but it was flat and wide. After about 2 hours of walking, I stopped to drink water and check my bearings. My compass and map said I was heading in the right direction. The road twisted a bit, going deeper and deeper into thicker woods. Pines and maples were packed on both sides, and the canopy above blocked a lot of the light. After another hour, the road began to narrow. It was clear no trucks or even off-roaders had been through here in years. The sides were closing in with branches and brush. I had to duck under fallen limbs. At one point, I had to climb over a half-rotten log that had collapsed right across the road. My boots were already damp from the wet ground. By the time the sun started to drop, I'd covered maybe 6 or 7 miles. I found a small clearing off to the side of the road that looked like a perfect place to set up camp. It was flat, covered in pine needles, and backed against a rocky rise that gave some wind cover. I dropped my pack, cleared out a spot, and set up my tent. That night, I boiled water and made one of those freeze-dried meals. I sat near the fire I had built in a ring of stones and listened to the quiet. No wind, no birds, no insects either now that it was colder. Just the sound of trees creaking in the distance. The kind of stillness that makes your ears ring. I slept light. I always do in the woods. Every crack of a twig or distant snap makes me stir. But that night was uneventful, just cold and quiet. In the morning, I got up early, made instant coffee, packed up, and continued down the road. About 3 miles further in, I found something strange. The road curved to the left, but something caught my eye off to the right, a clearing through the trees. I stepped off the road and moved through the brush to check it out. What I found was unexpected. It was an old structure, not a cabin, but something larger. Maybe an old equipment shed or work building from the logging days. It was long, rectangular, and built with heavy wooden planks. The roof had caved in at one side, and the whole thing looked like it had been rotting for decades. Moss grew over the sides. There were no windows, and the only door had fallen off its hinges. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. I felt a weird pressure in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something else, like a sudden stiffness. Something about that building made me feel heavy. Still, I walked up to it. I stepped inside. The air was thick and musty. It smelled like mold, rust, and wet earth. The inside was empty except for some old metal frames and a few barrels tipped on their sides. There were claw marks on the inside of one of the walls. Not fresh, not even recent, just deep grooves, almost like an animal had tried to get out. But it didn't look like bear claws. The spacing was strange, too wide apart. I took a picture with my phone, even though I had no signal. I didn't stay long. I hiked another mile or so and found a narrow trail branching off from the road. It looked old, really old. Grass had grown over it completely. I don't even know why I followed it. I think I just wanted to see where it went. Felt like this forest had stories, and I wanted to find one. That was a mistake. The trail got harder to follow as it went on. It dipped into a shallow ravine and then climbed up the side of a hill. The trees got thicker, more deadfall. My legs were getting sore, and my pack felt heavier. I should have turned around. I really should have, but I kept going. The first real warning sign came when I noticed the tracks. They were boot prints. Not fresh, but not old either. Deep enough to still be clear. Bigger than my foot and wider too. They went in the same direction I was heading. That surprised me. I hadn't expected to see anyone out here. I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead. No signs of campsites. No wrappers or trash or beer cans anywhere. Just these prints. I followed them for almost a mile, and that's when I started getting the feeling. That crawling feeling up the back of my neck. Like someone was watching. Every time I stopped, the woods seemed to close in tighter. I would turn slowly and look behind me, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just trunks and shadows. But that feeling wouldn't go away. I kept thinking I heard something behind me. A crunch, a step, a shuffle. But every time I stopped, it stopped too. Eventually, the prints just stopped. There was no turn, no jump to the side. They just ended. I stood there staring at the ground for a long time. It didn't make sense. It was like the person had just vanished into thin air. That was when I decided to head back. I turned around and started back down the trail. I moved faster now. My pack thumped against my back with every step. I didn't take breaks. I just wanted to get back to the road, back to my tent, maybe even back to the truck. My stomach was tight. My hands were sweating even though the air was cold. It was almost dark by the time I reached the logging road again. I was exhausted, but I didn't want to camp near that side trail. I walked another half mile before I found a spot to camp. I barely ate. I didn't build a fire. I just got into my tent and laid there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. That night, I heard movement outside the tent. Not animals. I've heard bears, deer, raccoons. I know what they sound like. This was soft, careful, like footsteps trying not to be heard. They circled my tent once, slowly, then again, closer this time. I held the revolver in my hand under the sleeping bag and didn't move. My breathing was so shallow I almost passed out. After a while, the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour, then nothing, just the wind in the trees again. In the morning, I looked around the tent. No tracks, no sign of anything, but I knew what I heard. I packed up and started walking fast. I didn't stop. I barely drank water. I just wanted to get out. Every few hundred feet, I looked behind me. I never saw anyone, but I could feel them, like a weight behind the trees. A shadow always just barely out of sight. By the time I reached my truck, it was afternoon. My legs were shaking. My shirt was soaked in sweat. I threw my pack into the bed and got in the driver's seat. I locked the doors before I even put the key in the ignition. I didn't relax until I hit pavement again. I still don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was some hunter. Maybe someone living off the grid who didn't like visitors. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But the way those tracks ended, the way the forest felt, the way something circled my tent and left no sign, It doesn't sit right with me. I went back and looked at satellite maps after I got home. That trail I followed is not on any map, not on GPS, not on the old forestry plans. It just disappears into the trees. That building I found, also not marked anywhere. And that picture I took of the claw marks, gone. Just black static when I opened the file, like it never saved. I haven't gone hiking alone since, and I don't think I ever will. After I quit my job, I didn't really know what to do next. I've been working in IT support for the past 6 years, staring at a screen all day, answering the same questions, typing the same things over and over again. My mind felt cooked by the time I finally left. I wasn't fired or anything. I just walked out one Friday and never came back. I left a message with HR, returned my badge, and that was that. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't even know myself. But I packed a backpack, loaded it with gear I bought from a camping store the day before. Tent, sleeping bag, knife, headlamp, some dehydrated meals, water filter, and a couple of maps, and I drove north. I didn't use GPS after a certain point. I just followed the side roads until I ended up in a small gravel lot at the edge of some unnamed forest land, surrounded by pines and hardwoods so thick I couldn't see far past the tree line. There were no other cars there, no signs, just the trailhead and a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the woods. It was early morning when I started walking. I didn't have any real plan other than to go in deep, stay a few nights, and clear my head. The air smelled like pine needles and cold dirt. It was September, and the mornings were already chilly, though the days warmed up fast. The trail was narrow but easy to follow at first. The forest got thicker the farther I went. Trees leaned in closer, and the sunlight started to come through in narrow shafts. The deeper I went, the more the trail faded. After about 3 hours, the path was just patches of flattened leaves and broken twigs. By noon, I'd reached a small clearing near a creek. It looked like a good place to stop. I set up my tent in the center where the ground was flat. I filtered some water from the creek, boiled it, then poured it into one of the food packs and waited for it to soften. The sound of the water running over the rocks made everything feel calm. I remember thinking that this was exactly what I needed. No work, no emails, no people, just me and the woods. That first night was uneventful. I heard some owls and small animals moving through the leaves. A raccoon came close to my tent at one point. I saw the outline through the nylon, but it didn't linger. I had a small flashlight, but I kept it off most of the time. I wanted to let my eyes adjust to the dark, and surprisingly, I didn't feel scared. The next morning, I packed everything and moved deeper into the forest. I wasn't following a marked trail anymore, just moving north based on the sun and the slope of the land. The terrain got steeper in some areas. I used my knife to cut through thick undergrowth when I had to. Around midday, I found an old game trail. It wasn't meant for people, but it was easier to follow than bushwhacking the whole way. I walked for most of the day until I came across what looked like an old hunting blind up in a tree. It was rotting, and the ladder had fallen off, but it caught my attention. There were old cans scattered around the base, rusted and half-buried in the dirt, a crushed thermos. I even found a torn glove. Everything looked like it had been there for years. I looked up at the blind and thought about climbing up just to see the view, but the wood was falling apart. I decided it wasn't worth the risk. I set up camp a little farther away, next to a rock wall that looked like the edge of a small ridge. I made sure to hang my food from a branch to keep animals away. That night felt different. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because I was so far in and hadn't seen a single person. Not even signs of people. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. I kept hearing branches snap, not close but not far either. The kind of sound you notice because it doesn't blend in with the regular noises of the forest. I told myself it was deer or maybe a bear moving through. I kept the knife close. I tried to sleep but kept waking up. Something felt off. I never saw anything. No shapes or sounds that I could explain clearly. But it was like something was near my camp without ever coming into it. In the morning, I noticed the food bag had been cut down. It wasn't torn like a bear would do. The rope had been sliced clean through. The bag was gone. The branch it had been tied to was still there, the rope hanging loose. My knife was still inside my tent where I left it. I stood there staring at the rope for a long time. Then I checked the area around the tree. No tracks, no claw marks, just a clean rope and empty space. That's when I started to really feel it. Not just discomfort, not just unease, but actual fear. My first thought was that someone else was out here, maybe living in the woods, and they'd found my camp. Maybe they were desperate, or maybe they just didn't want me here. I packed everything in under 10 minutes and moved. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just filtered a bottle of water and started walking fast in the opposite direction of where the blind had been. I told myself I'd make it back to the creek and then find my way out from there. I didn't want to be out another night, but the forest started to feel unfamiliar. I tried to follow the same path, but nothing looked the same. I didn't want to use my compass too much because I was trying to keep moving, and I wasn't sure if someone was following me. I didn't hear anything for hours. No branches breaking, no weird sounds, but I kept looking over my shoulder. By late afternoon, I found what looked like a path that might have led toward the direction I came from. I followed it for over an hour. That's when I found the second blind. It wasn't the same one. This one was newer. Not brand new, but it looked like it had been used recently. The ladder was still attached. There were fresh boot prints around the base. I crouched and looked closer. There was a crushed cigarette but next to a flat rock. The ashes were still there. I touched the wood of the ladder. It was warm, like someone had just been there not long ago. I felt my stomach tighten. Whoever was using it had probably seen me, maybe more than once. I didn't know how long they'd been watching me, or if they were still nearby. I backed away slowly and walked in the opposite direction, trying not to run, but I was shaking. I moved fast, cutting across rough terrain and ignoring the branches that scratched my arms and face. I didn't set up camp that night. I just walked until the sun was almost gone and then crouched under a tree, wrapped myself in the sleeping bag, and tried not to make a sound. I didn't light anything. I didn't cook. I just waited in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard someone walking. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. I held my breath. They stopped a short distance from where I was hidden behind some brush. Then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I don't know how long they stayed there. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. But eventually, I heard them walk away. The next morning, I ran. I didn't even bother with my pack. I left it there. I just kept my water filter in my pocket and ran with the knife in my hand. I wasn't even thinking straight anymore. I just wanted to get out. I don't know how many miles I covered, but it felt endless. My legs were burning. My throat was dry. I stopped at a stream at one point and drank straight from it, even though I knew it was risky. Then I saw the cabin. It was small, deep in the woods, barely visible through the trees. The roof sagged. The windows were covered in grime. It looked abandoned at first, but then I saw the clothesline, a thin rope with shirts and pants hanging from it, fresh, drying in the sun. I stopped moving. That's when I heard the door open, just a creak. I turned and ran again, straight into the woods, not even caring which direction I was going. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until my legs gave out and I collapsed into some tall grass near a dry creek bed. I laid there for hours, covered in sweat and leaves, shaking. Eventually, I pulled myself up and kept moving. By evening, I stumbled back onto a dirt road. I followed it for what felt like miles until I reached a gate and a small ranger shack. It was locked, but there was a number posted. I broke open the box with a rock and used the emergency satellite phone. I didn't tell them the full story. I just said I was lost and hadn't eaten in days. They sent someone out. I spent the night at a small station where they gave me food and let me sleep on a cot. In the morning, I left and never reported the cabin. I didn't want to explain what I saw. I didn't want to go back, not even to recover my gear. It's been months since then. I haven't gone hiking again. I don't think I ever will. I bought a lock for my apartment door even though I live on the 5th floor. Sometimes I still dream about that second blind. The boot prints in the dirt. the silent footsteps in the night. Whatever that was out there, it wasn't a ghost or monster. It was a person, someone who didn't want to be found, someone who didn't want me there. And I think I was lucky to get out when I did.